Welcome everyone to the program and to another conversation, where today I'm joined by a friend and fellow traveler to talk about her travel experiences and why we travel and what we can learn from closing our front door behind us and venturing out into the great wide yonder. The urge to voyage and discover is part of what makes us human. And so joining me today on the other side of the Atlantic from my home here in France to chat about her travels is my delightful guest, Dee Marcoux. Dee, thank you very much for being here with us on Viking.TV from your home in Canada. And today of all days, because it's your birthday. So Dee, on behalf of all of us, a very happy birthday to you.
Thank you very much, Alastair. Yes, another year gone by, faster than the speed of light.
You know, I always, the older I get, the harder I find it is to celebrate birthdays. And a friend once told me, he said, "Don't worry, it's just another circuit of the sun." And I always rather like that. Do you have a little celebration plan for later? I'm sure you do, Dee. I know you.
Well, you know, Michelle and I celebrate big moments and small ones, especially the small ones. And so this will follow much the same pattern. You know, he will have selected the proper wine, and we will sit down, write our cards about what's special for the day, because we always write cards together and then read them out loud and do all that stuff. And then and make sure that we actually truly connect with why another year is wonderful, because you've added more things on your string of experience. Even if it's COVID, it doesn't matter. You've grown, learned, experienced, yet another year, you know. So I like birthdays to be low key, but to connect to just the value of taking time out and acknowledging all the wonderful things that are in your life, you know. So today we've got sunshine. You'll light a bonfire. You'll sit outside dressed in proper colors. Just have to...
Sounds wonderful. Dee, in the name of full disclosure, I should just mention that we've known each other for a while. I first met you and your husband, Michel, in 2017 on a world cruise on board the Viking Sun, and we stayed in contact ever since. So Dee, why don't we start by you introducing yourself to us and just tell us a little bit about who you are and where you are.
Who am I? A person of many differences. Yes, we did meet on December 31st, 2017 at the captain's table dinner for New Year's dinner, and had a delightful conversation. And I discovered my husband's the photographer, and I was sitting beside a photographer. But you inspired all sorts of thoughts for me, not about photography, but how photography and words can connect. It was a lovely conversation. It kind of reconciled me right off the bat to actually sharing on ship with other people, because I tend to, you know, make sure that you don't lock into friendships or anything too soon and discover on the rest of the trip they were a bit thin. So that was the first time we met. So what about me? Traveled a lot as a child because of my father's job. When I say traveled, I just meant where we got relocated to. And I went to 14 different schools before I got to university, just to let you know that there was a lot of change in my life. This was extremely hard on my siblings. They're not good, you know, at that constant dislocation. You don't make friends that, you know, that are always there, and there's, you know, you've had a friend since you were a baby, stuff like that, you know. I don't have any of that. Mm-hmm. But I thrived on it. So some kids don't do well, some kids do really well, and I think it just got in my blood. So I became itinerant. So even though I went to university, and it took me 4 years, you know, to get my first degree in engineering, the summers you were always somewhere else. And of course I went into mining and metallurgy, which meant I always got summer work in some other esoteric place that nobody had even heard of, because mining jobs don't exist in corporate offices until you're at the corporate level. Mm-hmm. So that was all good fun. So that traveling really embedded myself in the experience of actually having a different culture. Even city to city in Canada, our provinces are very different. They're like Quebec is, you know, it's French speaking. You know, you're in Ontario, English speaking, the further west you get, the more English they are, the less French influence, et cetera, et cetera. But we were born out of many provinces that finally came together, probably because of the threat of the USA in the early days. And so you experience that provincially differences in Canada. My dad was born in Manitoba. My mother was born in Nova Scotia. So all that kind of experience. And the two best moves, of course, were we moved to England, where thank God the language was the same. So you could go in, but I was put into British schools. My dad would have nothing to do. He was in the Canadian Navy, and he would have nothing to do with us being separated, like sent to an American school, to let us feel like we were home. He said, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. He's a very curious man about everything. And so was my mother. And so that curiosity and that openness, and sure, you had troubles and hard times, but nevertheless, everything merged. And we transferred to England. We also were transferred to Scotland, which most people would think, well, it's all part of the UK. But I had a hard time understanding some of those Scots, I can tell you.
I know. Me too. My father's Scottish. Yeah.
But it was, so my dad, who didn't believe in holidays, but on weekends, he would go out family picnics to places close to where, like say we lived in Glasgow, and he'd get out into Scotland, or he would get out into England, into Wales. And there would always be something that he would take us to see, not necessarily tourist attractions, but things that interested him. And my mother, as I said, was equally curious, but they weren't curious about the same things. There was a lot of friction between my parents, which is too bad. They were wood to wood. But as a child, I benefited from that. My mother was an artist. My father was an engineer. His favorite words is, what's the plan? My mother's favorite words is, I wonder what the day will bring. So I think I was brought up with the expectation of adaptation and appreciation for difference. And that is a very lucky thing to be brought up in with life. Because instead of differences dividing people, they actually added. So my mother's curiosity about art, and she'd say, well, how many greens am I looking at this beautiful forest? And my father's saying, now that's a pine tree, and that's how it grows. That blend. I think I inherited, the appreciation of learning in the truest sense of the word from that. So I'm glad I was moved so much as a child. But then I got in my blood, and I couldn't stop.
Yeah. No, I mean, it sounds in many ways like, you had it sounds like you've had a rather wonderful childhood in many ways. I was thinking with just when you said about curiosity, we have that in common. My father really, the one gift he gave me was the gift of being curious about what's over the horizon, or how does that work, or what is that for, or who's that person? And that's a wonderful gift to give a child, I think. But I think, like you said, your siblings weren't quite so relaxed about all this upheaval and 14 different schools. And I guess you either sort of swim or sink, really, with that kind of a childhood. It sounds like you definitely took advantage of it.
Yes, I did. But I was also the middle child. So my job was to make peace no matter what. So those differences for me, it was always to teach people, if you will, that differences are wonderful. They're not bad things.
And what
I
kind
always
of
say, diversity doesn't mean division. They come from the same Latin word, but they do not mean the same thing. There doesn't have to be a division between people just because you're diverse. Get over it.
Yeah, I could not agree more. If many more people realize that. What kind of family holidays did you take? Did you?
Dad did not. I was about 12 or 13 before I realized that most dads didn't work Saturdays and Sundays. He was an absolute workaholic in the best of senses. He loved his work so much that to work more was a pleasure for him. So except for the times when he thought that it was time for a family picnic or something, go to Wales and, where we should go to a museum, or we should go to Oxford and actually see what the universities look like and the Bodleian Library and stuff like that. My dad just did not take vacations. So by the time I was doing household chores to earn my allowance, because my dad also believed that you had to contribute, we had two choices. We could do those things on Saturdays and Sundays and help Mom, or I could go to work with Dad, which seemed like a much better thing to do. So when we were in England, we were transferred to England more than once. We were transferred 3 times. But on his second work, he was building submarines, and he's power engineer for submarines. And so I'd go in with him, and he would take me through, the process of the building. He showed me how to read drawings and got me really interested. Because if I was going to accompany him, it wasn't just to sit in the corner and read a book by myself. It was actually so I could see what my dad did. Mm-hmm. And of course, that got me really interested in the other side of life. Like there was my mother with her painting, and then there's my dad with this incredible other language. So math and physics are the tools of engineering. They're languages to describe what we don't understand, but we can describe it in a way to utilize it. That's what engineers do. How can you actually say that there's an imaginary number, for instance? And so when I decided to go to university, I left England when I was 18 to go back to Canada to get ready for university. Because if I'd taken university in England, because my parents stayed behind, I would have been more years getting my degree. Would have taken longer. I had to do A levels as well as O levels and all the educational process there. And of course, when you're 18, you think life is going to be over in 5 or 6 years. You're so impatient, and you think that you're so ready. And so my first trip, I think you asked me when I took my first trip on my own, that was me leaving my parents in England and traveling back to Canada. So my father was very proud of me going into engineering. My mother was cautious. I thought it was okay. I could really have done any degree I wanted because all learning was interesting to me. I couldn't have done a language degree. That language I couldn't wrap my mind around. Math and physics and stuff like that, that's a different kind of language. I was okay with it. But, so I wouldn't have done well in the linguistics course. But off I went, so confident, and there I came back. I think you also asked me about when my first trip was. Did I tell you that we traveled by ship? I was 9 years old, just had turned 9 years old with our first family trip, but it was because the Navy had transferred us to England, and if you're in the Navy, the family gets the choice to fly or go by ship. Mm-hmm. So my first trip was actually down the St. Lawrence Seaway with my father talking to me all about that, and he was as knowledgeable as anybody about what was actually going on, talked to me about the whole ship, the power. I was only 9 years old, but I was such a curious child,
Yeah, but you were lucky to have the father you had, and he was able to sort of grow that curiosity. I think that's a wonderful thing, really great. But you graduated, Dee, with an engineering degree in 1970, and you went on to have a truly stellar career in the energy industry. But I'm curious to know, what was it like being a woman then, a very male-dominated profession?
Well, there were a few setbacks. Like, I went into mining and metallurgy. Actually, I didn't go into mining per se because women weren't allowed underground at that time. If you want to know a peculiar fact about the mining industry. So it wasn't going to do me a whole hell of a lot of good to go into mining and be an underground miner. No. So I worked on what we call extraction and beneficiation and the upgrading so that you could take the ore they found and turn it into something useful, like the metal that you're mining, whatever. And so that's what I graduated in. It became quite difficult to find work because there was still some resistance to women. I remember in my early days going to visit some of the sites before I, because they were trying to attract people into their companies. Atlas Steel is one of them. And I arrived, for my plant tour to see if I was interested in that company when they realized that D didn't stand for David.
Oh,
And
no.
they kept me waiting for 30 minutes before they'd actually got permission from corporate office to let me go into the plant, because they knew that the men in there were going to go, what? And I said, look, I've got coveralls on, a hard hat on, safety glasses on, big steel toe boots. Who's going to know I'm a woman? And they go, they'll know. So, oh yeah, there was some, but you know what? A sense of humor and confidence, not cockiness, but confidence and a sense of humor gets you through almost anything in life. And so I would just joke with them. They had a problem. It wasn't my problem. Let's find a way to, get over it. And just test me on what I know and what I can do. And I said, and I'm not going to cause a problem. And I promise you, I'll always wear my coveralls and my hard hat and my safety glasses. And frankly, being a woman won't matter much. So
Good for you.
that's how I just dealt with it, because it was humorous when you think about it. But this was the 70s, and it was just unusual to see somebody. If women were in engineering, they usually migrated to what I call the safer ends of engineering, and they almost all did office, corporate stuff. I wanted to be in the field. I wanted to be in locations that nobody would ever be in, like Fort McMurray. And of course, we mined oil. So when you say I was in the energy industry, actually we were mining oil sands. So I started to fall in love with things like sand.
Mm-hmm. We're coming to that.
So anyway, it never stopped me. I ended up finding that guys actually liked working with me. We weren't two males, we didn't have much to prove to each other. And so with a sense of humor and confidence, meaning not that I'm right, but that I'm listening, that we're actually talking about a problem and I'm listening and you're listening, and between us we're solving the problem, and a little sense of humor, it solves a lot of problems in the world. So.
And when you traveled for your work, which you did a lot, and you went to all kinds of places, was it possible to take time out to explore a little bit of where you were?
I usually explored more like in the communities and stuff because of the impact our operations might be having on communities. But I'd rarely go to like the capital of the country. We were in Madagascar. I might go to the capital to meet, one of the ministers or something in charge of, that industry. Mm-hmm. But frankly, when I used to go on a lot of my trips, they were all, when I got to the director level, and it wasn't just for companies myself, I would go on purpose to sites because with the background I have, most people on boards of directors, for instance, do not, they're finance people, that are necessary, people who've got human resources so they can run a human resources committee or whatever. But our boards have gone overboard with the audit and the financial side of the business, and so people who actually know how you made the money were pretty rare. And so I weaseled my way in, so that in fact I used to do a lot of site visits. So you'd have to understand the context, so the country context and the community context that got you out and saw the real stuff. That informed most of my travel. Because Michel was self-employed, he could travel with me, so I often took him with me. And then he'd go and do what I'd call more the tourist side, but he was an intelligence gatherer. And even though he can't speak a lot of languages, he can sound like he's speaking Japanese if he wants to, because he can hear the songs. So he'd be my outside man, my bag man, if you will, that helped me appreciate fully the context of the mine in a community, and he would help me, understand the context of its impact and all the rest of it on the greater sense of country. But before I started traveling with ships for pleasure, I logged 2.5 million miles in a plane. That's how much I've traveled the world.
That's a lot. Yeah, that's a.
I've been around the world the equivalent of every year I've been alive. So.
Wow. Okay, you certainly have traveled.
Yeah.
But you retired in 2017, and since then, together with your husband Michelle, you've taken quite a lot, Viking cruises. There are a lot of cruise companies out there, Dee. What was it that made you choose Viking?
Well, I didn't.
Oh, we chose you.
No, in 2016, I was sitting at my desk. Actually, I was reading board material. We lived on the west coast at the time. That was Vancouver. We weren't in the city of Vancouver. I will not live in a big city if I can avoid it. We were out on the coast. Had to take a ferry into Vancouver. We weren't on an island, but there were no roads that connected us to that part of the mainland. Anyway, Michelle walks in, and he's holding the phone, and he said, "I need you to make a decision." I said, "Okay." And he says, "I've been following this, I've had a dream," he says, "and we haven't been able to execute it, but I'd really love to travel around the world by ship. Pack your luggage once, get on the ship, and then it takes you, and no more worries." And I said, "Yes, that sounds interesting." He said, "Well, I read an advertisement last week, and it's about this amazing world cruise, 152 days or something, and you travel around the world on the same ship, same cabin, everything's great." And he said, "I'd love to do that." And I looked at him with a great deal of shock and said, "Yes, but no, we've never spent 144 consecutive days together, let alone on a ship. And what the hell would I do? Because this is what I'm doing." And he said, "Well, we have to make a decision now, because I phoned them and we would want, a suite, because I know we've got different sleep cycles and we need to have a bedroom where you can close the door from the rest of the place." I said, so I phoned them to see if that was available. And they said it wasn't, but there was one that was on hold but hadn't actually dropped the deposit. And he says, they phoned me back and said it's come available. Now, we have to say yes or no right now. I said, what?
Yeah.
But I trust him. My husband and I are very different, but we're wood and sandpaper. We polish each other all the time. And I'm surprised he'd never told me about this dream. But anyway, I said, how much will we lose if I say yes and then I change my mind? He told me the amount. And I said, well, we're not frivolous people, but let's say yes, because saying no is stupid, and I haven't had time to think about it. So and you'll probably persuade me in the end that yes is the right answer. He said, okay. So he signed us up, which meant I had to retire. I wasn't planning retirement. My company.
Oh, right. Okay. Wow.
And I had a year to think about it. It was May 21st, 2016, when he walked into my office. It was also partly because I'd been the caregiver for my dad, who died in 2012, a caregiver for my mom, who died in 2015, and I was the caregiver for my sister, who had an incurable cancer, but her doctor told me I could travel, that she was healthy enough and that she wasn't going to die imminently, etc. And he said, now that your mom and dad have gone, he says, I've never brought it up to you because you couldn't have left Canada for that period of time. So bless him, he just hung on to his dream without putting any pressure on me. But in 2016, he figured he was clear to go. And so there we were.
That's lovely.
Well, I fretted for a year, what am I going to do? Because retirement hadn't crossed my mind. I loved the job, I loved the traveling, I loved making a difference, seeing the sights, bringing to the board actually a ground level understanding of what's actually how we make the money. It's not about how much you make, you won't make good money if you don't actually understand what's going on in the operations, know how to bring people through all the rest of it. But I realized I'd started to define myself by my work. This was a good time to redefine myself. And so on the ship I got. And that was one hell of a wonderful opportunity to redefine what you want. And that Viking ship couldn't have been a better ship to do it. The minute I walked on board, the quality, that Haywood Hills collection of books, no places to explore on the ship. You didn't have to get off that ship to get your curiosity about anything settled. I met, of course, the chief engineer who I sweet talked into a private tour. I got to see the environmental work that they do in their recycling systems. I got to see their power systems. I got to see the care. I could walk around that ship 1,000 times a day, which pretty much I did. Never found a piece of rust. The maintenance ethic is so high on that ship. There's nothing on that ship that isn't quality. And the thing I love best about Viking, you pay for the space that you call yours, your cabin, but when you walk out that door, you are the same equal standing person as everybody else on that ship. There's no first class, there's no hierarchy of the low life and the high. You're all have the opportunity to have the same experiences, enjoy the same spaces that are shared. There's no, I love that. It's a Norwegian, it's a country culture that I love as well. Yeah. And it just, so if Viking hasn't heard it from me, they're hearing it now. That quality, but that sense of equality. And they're happy to satisfy any of your curiosity, right?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And I like what you said about the whole egalitarian side of things. You're absolutely right. And I think that does link back to the sort of Scandinavian, Norwegian mindset. As you said, there's very little formality once you're on board, and no one is, whether you're staying in the owner's suite or you're in different staterooms, everyone's on the same level.
Nobody, the first question, I've only ever been on 2 cruises before in my lifetime, other than, the passenger ship going to England, which was not, quote, a cruise ship. Passenger ships at that time, it was an option just like flying. But the first one was, I won't mention the name, but it wasn't a party ship, but there were slot machines. That's all I can say. That was another one my husband signed us up for, and I told him I never wanted to be on a cruise ship again, because the first question people would ask you was, what's your cabin number? So they could slot you into how much money you had. Yeah. And the second one we took was just the postal boat. And you can't get more basic than that. I mean, their sense of a double bed is a twin bed head to head. I'd say, are we going to sleep toe to toe or head to head, And it was at once just literally a ferry for working the coast, delivering post and all the rest of it, and had started to take on passengers for tourism. Yeah. Because, Norway got wealthy on its oil and cleverly spent it on infrastructure. So there were better roads and airports and all the rest of it. So the postal boats were losing that magic. And that was the first time I experienced that Norwegian levelness. Nobody cared what cabin you were in, right?
Lovely. I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
So when we got on Viking, my worry was that allergy to having that same experience, even though we were assured it wasn't a party ship and a casino ship. Yeah. You combine that with people who've all signed up for 142 days together. You created a small village for 4 months, and you had that marvelous sense that everybody was there for their own reason, and everybody was curious about everything, but that was nurtured, if you will, by that Viking thing. And that was the glory.
I wanted to ask you, Dee, how you would, and you've touched on it already, but how you would define the differences between a world cruise and, because you've taken other cruises as well that weren't world cruises, and there's a big difference between a world cruise and, let's say, a 15-day itinerary cruise. And I mean, there's the obvious differences, which World Cruise is a lot longer and you visit more places. But I think for me, one of the things that I particularly enjoyed about that World Cruise when I met you was you get a lot more sea days. And I love sea days. I mean, sometimes I could just give me the sea days. And I think you're a little bit of the same mindset.
I love being at sea.
Yeah.
There's countries are not as much. They're important, but being at sea, I have a whole different feeling. First, it's always different. I mean, the shape of the clouds, for heaven's sakes, and the smell in the air. But the discovery of land, when you're at sea, especially if you're at sea days, and so you're 7 or 8 days where you haven't seen any land, if you haven't figured out in your gut, which is very hard to reach now because we all know world maps and we know the world is round, but if you're in the middle of the ocean and you've been traveling for days and the radius around you is the same distance, no matter how many hours you've traveled, you know the world has to be curved. You can feel it, because although it still looks flat, no matter where you look, it's the same radius, and you've been traveling for 3 days. When you're on a plane at 35,000 feet, now that they've barred us from the cockpit, you cannot see that curve. You could at one time when you were curious enough, and the captains would let you go up and sit in. But now we only know it because it's sailors figured out the world was round.
Yeah, and I know just recently you've been on Viking's new explorer ship, the Octantis. Where did you travel from and to, Dee?
It was a very short trip because we figured it was okay for us to start traveling again. See, my husband and I are in that age group, that says that you might not have a secondary condition or an underlying condition, but you're certainly vulnerable. So we'd been 4 times vaccinated. We had reached the saturation point, not of being careful, but of lack of we don't need a lot of stimulation because we keep ourselves interested and we've got things that keep us busy. But just the pleasure again. And I really wanted to see the Octantis. But we'd signed up for the Polaris. And so we had that in our kit bag. So I thought, well, why don't we just take this two-week journey on the Octantis and take its inaugural run into Canada. And so we waited and waited until we got a good cabin that like I said, we're on different sleep cycles. It sounds silly, but actually, if we get to the door between that bathing suit and that bedroom and my workspace, like I'm in trouble. And so it popped up for this magic little entrance, and I always wanted to go through the locks. Remember, I've done the St. Lawrence Seaway, but you always have to stop, at the locks. And so that was it. And I got to talk to Hoost, I think. Hoost is VP operations or something. And Hoost was adamant, that I would get the lock experience of my life, because the ship has a bow, so you can actually be out in the front instead of on the side railings or something. And so I got my dream. Because the St. Lawrence Seaway, my dad used to talk about it a lot as an engineer. See, he was a power engineer for ships, but he had a nuclear engineering degree. He's one of the first person in Canada. Canada didn't have them. That's why we were transferred to England the first time. So my dad could get his certificate and equivalent papers for a degree in nuclear. But Dad talked a lot about the St. Lawrence Seaway, how it had been 40 years talked about, but it was hard to get big USA to join in with tiny Canada and share the costs in an appropriate manner. So let's just say it took a long time to get there. So they were built over the 10 years, and they were opened officially in 1958. Well, that was the year we got transferred to England, So Dad, who wanted to go to the opening and had me convinced I was going to be at the opening of these locks, off we were to England instead. And so I had these locks in my mind, and you can go through them in a small boat, but, just never. And when I found out that the Octantis was going to do the Great Lakes, I thought we just have to grab this, and so we did. And so we were lucky. We got the room that we needed, and we got on the ship and saw what we were going to get when we get on the Polaris. So we got to explore the ship in those 14 days, and the weather was awful, which was marvelous for me because I don't care what the weather is. There's no bad weather. And we at least stopped at PEI, which was great, so I could pick up the red sand there. The red sand at PEI is quite extraordinary. So we did that, saw the locks, and knew that we were only 26 kilometers away from home, and it gave you that funny feeling that you were, well, the first set of locks is actually through St. Lambert, which is where Michelle's son lives. They said that they were not going to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and wave to us. Anyway,
wonderful.
But that was it. And the Explorer, it's a very different ship than the ocean ships.
Yep.
The fundamentally wonderful things about Viking are still there, the quality, et cetera, et cetera. But the best thing about it, it's auditorium. You don't go into a dark room. You go into a room that's got windows right down the back, and you could go in and sit in there without a lecture and love every minute of it.
I quite agree. Yeah, I know exactly what.
They've done it again. Vikings pulled it off again. An extraordinary ship. Lots to explore when you're on the ship. Haywood Hills did a marvelous job again with its books.
You have there's a big library on the Octantis. I enjoyed that a lot. Yeah. Dee, one of the things I really like about you is that you're a bit of a magpie when it comes to collecting souvenirs and memories of your travels. And in particular, rusty bits of metal. Now you're going to have to explain this to us, Dee. What is it about rusty bits of metal that so attracts you?
It didn't start off as anything to do with tourism or collecting souvenirs. I think my first site visit that I can remember, it was in Texas of all places, was the cleanest refinery I'd ever been in. I ran a refinery. Part of my background, I was a refinery manager in Edmonton. And we were thinking about bringing in some new technology, and I went to a refinery to check out the technology and talk to the operations people, not the sales guys, talk to the people who actually run the thing, find out, all the things I should know. Mm-hmm. Of course, they did a site tour with me, and I was out there, and I was so amazed at how clean it was. So we've got this saying in the oil industry, that a painted pipe, the oil flows faster in a painted pipe, which of course it doesn't technically, but what it means is a painted pipeline is a cared-for pipeline. Your maintenance is probably very high, your maintenance ethic. And so it just means a clean work site usually means a more productive work site, a safer work site, because people are embedded with a good maintenance ethic and they take care of things, and there's pride in taking care of things. And so I came back and started to see my own operations the same way. When I was at that site, I couldn't find anything. Usually you walk through a refinery and there'll be rusty bits, washers, which is not just litter, but it means that they're careless of the expense. I know a washer costs next to nothing. But if your attitude is they cost next to nothing, it's amazing how the small nothings add up. And we're in a highly competitive industry, and you can't afford to throw away money. But you also shouldn't be throwing it away. It is litter, right? So I started to pick up on site visits, little bits of rust, and then I'd go in and give my lecture, If I look at their safety record, the more rusty bits, the less well-maintained a plant is, I can guarantee you their safety record is also down in the lower quartile. It's just correlation. If you've got a high maintenance work ethic, you will run a better plant. And a better plant, a cleaner plant, is one that's got pride in place, and people take better care of the plant by themselves. They'll say to their buddy, you don't have your safety glasses on. You won't go macho. Well, Jack doesn't have safety glasses, but that's his choice. You actually say to your buddy, put on your safety glasses. Let's keep this place safe. It's not just you that it can affect, it's all of us. So they just became a little token, for me to pick up and make these remarks. Now, it's a longer speech, not a boring speech, but trying to get people to relook at how they work. When I started to travel the world, going to sites around the world, I started to use the same measure. I visited nickel refineries in Cuba, Madagascar, gold mines in South Africa, and all sorts of places. And I also started to find that if you could find rusty bits easily in the country, just walking off the plane or off the ship, that spoke to the country's maintenance ethic. And as an engineer, maintenance ethic is really important to me. As a householder, maintenance ethic is important to me. In Europe, maintenance is really important. Europe cares about it. It doesn't see that they build concrete buildings and just let them decay, and then you just replace them when they need replacing. You go to some countries, you wade through litter and construction rubbish and all the rest of it. Usually in countries where people don't own things, right? They have no sense of ownership. So it's the landlord that has to take care of this. It's the czar's problem, not mine, Yep. And so I just started picking them up small. I wasn't going to collect, a ton of rubbish. Right? It was just a way for me to see the country through a different set of eyes than, someone who wanted to see the Taj Mahal. I want to see beaches. I love sand and geology, and I look for litter to tell me about the country's maintenance ethic. It's probably an odd interest, but I have it. And then I'd start to bring them back to the ship, small bits. My husband likes to jump in and get me big bits because he thinks of them as works of art. And he's picking them up for a different reason, thinking it will please me. I keep on thinking, how am I going to get through that get that through the scanner on the ship without explanation? So I would display them in my cabin. And because, we had a bedroom separate from the rest of the room, I could actually bring people into the cabin. Or just the cabin cleaning crew would come in and they'd be like, what's this? And what does that represent? And of course, I also collect the sand. Before I put it in glass bottles, I put it in little petri dishes so I can study it. And I'd tell them that I follow the sand and I look for rusty bits and why. Well, you should have seen the look on their face. And so people started to enjoy it, which became very reinforcing. So I see the land for the geology, for its maintenance ethic. Those are the things I look for. And when I look for them, I don't look like I'm searching. They have to find me too, right? So that allows you to find the unexpected because you're not doing a tour to see something you expect to see. I've often found it disappoints me. I go to the pyramids, I'd be disappointed because they weren't grand and big like I expected them to be, and they're crowded up against, city. Don't go to them. Michelle loves to do that because he hasn't taken the photograph, and I'll actually just go to a botanical garden or a beach or something so I can feel the land. And so that's great. So that's the rusty bits and sand. And then I write about some of the finds because they were such an extraordinary insight. And then, but I write little vignettes that make that, you call a photograph a light graph, it's a memory made through light. So I've seen this and touched this, and I will write it, and I call them lexigraphs. So it's like me writing a photograph. A little moment that I could have taken a snapshot of, but instead I pick up the rusty bit and I take it back with me.
I love that idea. I just think that's wonderful. And one of the, rust is a very, can be very beautiful. The colors are very beautiful and it's extremely photogenic. I've often taken pictures of rusty old factories and things just because they're beautiful. But the other thing about rust is that it contains time. Because it wasn't rusty when it started out, and it's constantly changing, and it encapsulates time. And I think I love the idea of you collecting these little bits of rust from your various travels and bringing them back home, and then put them on display. I imagine. It's a great way
I'll
to
have a story.
engage the conversation. Yeah, it's a lovely way to have memories. I think really lovely. Thank you for sharing that with us. Dee, it's often said that travel nourishes the soul and makes us feel more alive. Of the many reasons for traveling, can you just give me one that's uppermost in your mind?
I never go traveling. First of all, the plan's already made. The ship has picked the itinerary. And I hate planning in the first place. And I don't go to see what generally going to that location is all about. So you go through Egypt, there's the pyramids, you go to Rome, we don't have to list all the things. And I deliberately don't plan, because what I want to find is what I wasn't looking for, if you get my drift. Mm-hmm. So if you look for something, you will find it. But if you don't look for something, you'll find what you needed to find. It's something like that. It's this, just be open, because you will find something that makes you marvel. Sinai Desert, it doesn't smell like any other desert I've ever been in. Or the burning bush. I know factually, because a hobby of mine's botany too. You can't be a mining engineer and not worry about what's growing on top of your ore body. I know geraniums are a desert flower. I've just never imagined it. So driving a long way in the Sinai Desert, and I saw this geranium, and my first thought was, the burning bush. Did Moses make a mistake when he saw the burning bush? And so that image is just so vivid in my mind. But the bus had to stop for, a pit stop or something, and I got out, and it's the first time I've smelled the Sinai Desert. And it really has its unique, dusty, yellowy, the dust that's on the peas in your garden that are growing or something, like it's this wonderful aroma. And I wasn't looking for that. And so it's those tiny surprises where your whole senses are suddenly organized differently. But if you go with expectation, you often have either a disappointment or your eyes are kind of closed to other things. Yeah. You're so anxious for it to be a good experience because your time is limited. But I'm not being negative. Like people who've got bucket lists of things that other people have admired and want to see, they have their interest. Mine is not to say it's better or not. I just, probably because of the damn curiosity that was beaten into me as a child, my own curiosity with these parents, that I just don't want to go looking for something that's known. That's all.
Yeah. No, I love the idea of not trying to just fulfill, or not arriving with a lot of expectations. It's almost a philosophy. It's a kind of Zen philosophy, right? Just be open and whatever, let things come to you. And I think that's,
yeah. I'll give you an example too. When we were in the Red Sea, which disappointingly didn't look too red, even though it's very hot, I decided at the last minute that I'd just go swim. So off we went, and we just got fins and bathing suits, and some of us I just wanted to get in the water. Mm-hmm. And then I was swimming along, and I was surrounded in a cloud of silvery red fish. Those silvery red fish are so fixed in my mind. And I thought, that's why they call it the Red Sea. It's got red fish.
Dee, let's bring our conversation to a close with, I thought we'd just swap a little imaginary voyages, most likely ones that we'll never take because reality and life get in the way, and because it's important sometimes it's important not to realize our fantasies. For example, I've always fantasized about hopping on one of those mile-long freight trains that you have over on your side of the Atlantic. And I would just sit there with the wagon doors open and my dobro guitar and a bottle of good bourbon whiskey, and just slide through the night across an endless landscape, and something like an Edward Hopper painting, that kind of feel to it. And I just wondered, do you have a fantasy voyage that just locked there in the back of your mind that you will never take, but you just somehow pops into your imagination?
The only, that we set out to cross all the lines of latitude and all the lines of longitude that you can cross with water. So that's not a fantasy. We're deliberately doing that. We are going to do the Canadian Arctic, unfortunately not on a Viking, they don't do that segment yet. When they will, I'll probably take theirs. Mm-hmm. But just to say that we have, in Canada anyway, done sea to sea to sea. I've worked in the Arctic, I've seen it, but not from a ship. But my real fantasy is just to circumnavigate the Antarctic. Because the trips you take are all about and things of interest to people. And I'd actually just like to go around that island for as long as it's still ice covered. And you can string, there's a couple of things that you can string together that get you nearly there. Mm-hmm. But nobody, because the weather's usually bad, passengers are usually seasick. And so the fantasy of that trip is probably more my imagining that I would not be affected by the weather or the oceans. But I would love to do that for just because it's just not available. I think that's it. I don't yearn to see any place in the world particularly. The trip itself is what I enjoy. Like you're talking about the train trip. It's actually just being on the train moving.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I don't care where it's going. It's just being on it, moving. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. It's the journey, not the destination. I think we agree on that. Yeah.
So it's because there's always something that's going to surprise you if you're open to it.
Got to be open to it. Absolutely. Dee, I think let's.
I warn you.
Sorry. Say again.
I said, have I worn you out?
Not at all. Not at all. We could go for another hour, but but you have to let James on, who's on the buttons, have a break.
Yes.
So thank you very much, Dee, for giving us your time and your thoughts and your inspiration. You're a very inspiring person, and I think for myself and all of us here at Viking, we're going to wish you once again a super and very happy birthday. Have a wonderful day. Thank you, Dee.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, Alastair. I love talking to you too.
I hope I'll see you soon. And a big hi to your husband, Michelle.
Oh, I hope you see me soon.
Okay. All right.
We have to get out and we have to be together. Okay?
Take care, Dee. All the best. Thank you so much. Bye now. Bye.